I am Gisela Carbonell, curator at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum here at Rollins College, and I want to welcome you to this very special event tonight. With me here are professors Dana Hargrove and Audrey Hope. They will be speaking about their works, which are part of our 2021 Faculty Biennial. Next Tuesday at 6 p.m., you'll hear from the other artists in the exhibition, Rachel Simmons and Lead Lines, and Professor Don Rowe. So we're going to start tonight with Donna Hargrove. Donna is professor of art at Rollins College. She teaches a variety of 2D courses, including graphic design, painting, and drawing. And her research focuses on ideas about perceptions of the land and of our sense of place and of space, which is a big part of this year's biennial, which focuses on environmental concerns and different approaches to memory, topography, and the landscape, among other things. Also with us tonight, you will hear from Audrey Hope, who is visiting assistant professor of art here at Rollins. She teaches contemporary approaches to sculpture, and her work oscillates between sculpture and installation. She uses fabric, photography, and metal to look at the ways that people instrumentalize the natural world. And she'll be talking a little bit more about her project in a little bit. So I'm going to pass it over to Dana, who will speak first. We will have time for questions after each presentation, so make sure you put your comments and questions in the comment box, and we'll be addressing those after each presentation. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna get started here, bring up my PowerPoint, and I'm timing myself. Is it up? I hope so. Anyway, so you might not know, but I'm from Scotland, and I lived there prior to the year 2000. And as you all know, Scotland's well known for its romantic landscapes, idyllic landscapes, picturesque landscapes, but it's also a land of stark contrasts of nature and culture, particularly where I come from. So Dundee, Scotland, as you can see here, I hope so anyway, is on the River Tay, estuary of the River Tay, and it's such a big city conglomerate. It's an industrial city, well known for the 3 J's, which is jute, jam, and journalism. And its culture has changed since the 19th century. The jute mills all closed down and lay empty. And it was kind of fun for us as artists to use them and work in them or have studios inside them, and for skateboarders and building their ramps in there. But as you can see, this industrial city, it started to shift with the close of the jute mills to think more about culture. And it's now known for Dundee, the city of discovery. So it has great pride in its culture, its art, its science, and its technology advancements here. So it's a city on a hill. What a prospect this is. I'm living there slightly to the right, and you can see these big multiple stories, we call them, these big buildings, skyscrapers, where a lot of the working class would live. And it's interesting to know that the people who worked in the jute mills when they were in the city down there on the docks, they all lived in the city centre in these tenement houses, but then they were cleared out, much like the Highland clearances, out into the schemes, and the schemes were usually in the suburbs. And so it kind of fractured the community of the working class. But as you can see there's 4 of them, multiple stories. This factors into a lot of my work for some reason. I mean, we were often there visiting friends, but there's such a skyline, such a presence for Dundee. And now they are no longer. They tore them down and moved the working class people further afield. So it's interesting to see the cycle of movement of people as culture changes, as landscape changes. Another factor of contrast then to the landscape of the sublime landscape that I lived in on this estuary were these big oil rigs that would come past my bedroom window up and down, pulled by a little tugging boat. So I was always like interested in the early days with that contrast of the natural with the man-made and impression we make on the landscape, whether we're carving the hills up to mine it for coal, or we're looking at mining it for oil, etc. So my work at this time period was mostly doing work inside the jute mills, and I'm doing site-specific interventions and often bringing back the interventions into the university, into the exhibition spaces, but having that kind of back and forth between the past, the gritty past, into the cultural future. So this is an example of one of those pieces where I copied the texture of the wall from the jute mill. So then in the year 2000, I moved to America, and this has changed everything for my work going forward. It was a time of culture shock, the first 6 months in America. And yeah, all the traits of culture shock I hit, you know, the anxiety, the disorientation, the uncertainty, the feeling that this new place, it was not friendly to me. I couldn't walk down the street, there was no pavements, the bread didn't taste good. So I felt out of place. And at the time I was there in Carbondale, Illinois, to do a master's degree in painting. So I put this anxiety, this culture shock into my work. And this is one of the very first pieces I made, 7 houses. And I'm looking at Levittown and the banality of suburban life, but also just that culture shock I was feeling, dissatisfaction. What I was seeing in where I was living was the homogenization of space and the lack of that past, that lack of that grit. And so the 7 houses were just sort of touching on that. At the same time, I was watching films like the Truman Show. I don't know if you guys remember that from 1998, but thinking about the place and the non-place, the simulacra of place, the sort of representation or the artificiality of place, but not the authentic. So this led me to looking at globalization. So thinking about why is that, and questioning things such as patriotism, nationalism, but looking at it from, you know, a consumer or capitalistic sort of point of view. So the work that I was making was really kind of dealing with that overproduction of our spaces, the parody of our natural world. So this piece here is just a sort of Disneyfied hill. And this is actually inspired by the small town celebration in Florida, which I wrote a paper about at the time, which actually I'd never been to Florida, but it's funny how I ended up in Florida to think about it. I was reading about celebration and how Disney had hired people, actors basically, to sit around on the porches and smile at people as they passed by, and dog walkers were hired by Disney to make it very appealing community so that people would buy into this small town and purchase a home. So I was interested in that simulated community and that parody of community. Yeah, and this led to looking further at the hyperreal and how that plays into our landscapes with this piece here. Okay, then I moved to Florida. So things are always shifting as I move place, because obviously my surroundings really affect the work I make. And one of the things about Florida is I had to travel by car everywhere. And that really, it fed into this particular piece that was a very pivotal piece that you can probably recognize strains of this in my current work. Looking at travel and our oversaturation of visuals as we travel, and the fragmentation of space, the speed in which we take in information as we travel, fed into this piece that's actually like 2 inches by 31, these paintings, just to kind of get that feeling as we travel down 1792. I don't know if you've been down that particular road in Orlando, but it's just complete bombardment of visuals and advertising as we travel, which is quite unnatural. This led to this piece that looked at the strip mall, and I was reading J.B. Jackson's accounts of vernacular landscapes, and really interested in the strip mall as a sort of non-place that exists all over America, and you could be anywhere in the strip mall. Doesn't have that true sense of place. Often it's very banal from the outset. And so I was looking at these commercial spaces as a sort of facade or a front, knowing full well there's like community, there's persons behind the scenes, but when corporate sort of molds come into play, we start to see the homogenization of space and the grids and the blocks starting to become a repetition. So this piece led to a series of work that I'm still working on called Facades. And I started to stack these strip malls on top of each other, and just to try and get that feeling of the facade of the corporate world. And I would actually take photographs of different cities and then take out a lot of the sort of personal information and deplace them, but allow a little remnant of certain factors that would clue you into a sense of place. What's really funny is that two of the pieces actually got bought by a corporate collection, now live inside the world in which they critique. So they're living in a boardroom. And in Orlando, they actually got bought and put on the side of a big condo building on Church Street. So again, another kind of apt, ironic placement for them, which reminds me of my site-specific works back in Dundee, Scotland. So that's sort of fascinating. I love it when that sort of stuff comes to play and your work is influenced directly by its surroundings, such as this condo building. Yeah, so I went to Dallas, and Dallas influenced my work further. You know, when I was living there for a month on an artist residency with the university, I was looking at all the empty shoe factories. So an industry that's ended, it's moved to China, and all these empty shoe factories are laying around. And yeah, there might be repurposing them, but a lot of them are just standing still and feel kind of lonely. So I started painting them and playing around. Wasn't sure how I would end up using these little paintings, cutouts. But in the end, they ended up like these little collage of conglomerate. I was trying to make a community again out of these lost industries and the people that would be within them that are now elsewhere. And going back to that stacking thing, I really was, you know, going back to also the multiple story buildings from Dundee, Scotland, but trying to create a facade of community by making these little sculptures that are just painted on two sides and have a sense of that fake hyper real. You feel the space, but it's not quite there because it's an illusion. And that's actually made one of the pieces that is in the exhibition called Arcadia X is this big tower here, 80 inches tall. And it's just a sort of different version of that idea of that sense of community and space and homogenization, but the facade of that and control of that. It's led into different facets. It kind of started to propel me to think about it in different ways of these homogenized blocks of capitalist space, stacking them up in different ways. Reminded me of the cairn. And the cairn is a very Scottish thing. When you go up a mountain, you're often reminded of the summit and the journey and like the capture, almost like a flag on the moon. By placing a stone on top of this pile, you're saying, yes, I own this landscape, I've conquered this mountain. And so that sort of fed into some of the ideas I was dealing with how we own landscape or control it or contrive it or place systems on it and represent it. There's a long history of landscape painting in Scotland, or in the British landscape tradition. So I'm tapping into these imperialistic views of ownership of landscape and how we represent landscape. Feeding into the idea of the cairn came when I visited Disney, and it was sort of funny. When I went to Disney, I saw a rock, and it was just a realistic looking rock, but it so happened it was a fake rock. It was this massive big fake rock, and I'm like, what was the point of that? They could just bring in a real rock. So this synthesized version of nature that we are almost more comfortable with the fake than the real, and the interface to the authentic and the reality, we're more comfortable with the slick version that advertising might give us. And I don't know if you've ever noticed or been to Animal Kingdom and seen the big tree of life, but this big tree of life took months to create and has thousands of handmade little leaves, completely fake and manufactured by man, intersecting with real nature, and birds come and visit it, and obviously tourists are fascinated. And at the same time, I'm thinking about real forests and monocrops and how we cultivate forests and landscapes and how we grow these rows of trees in a very artificial way, to talk about. It's feeding into this next project that I was really fascinated with, these trees that were surrounding me in another artist residency. But how we manipulate our landscapes and contrive our landscapes is really my touching point, my touchstone for everything I do for some reason. So this is the piece here I have in the museum called Treeline. It's a series of 6 of these ones, and it's ongoing series. And with this series, I'm really trying to get that Candyland effect of these buildings, skyscraper buildings, and at the same time, the growth of culture and nature intersecting with this hyperreality of the simulated version of itself. So I was trying to create the color schemes to really grow up into nature from a concrete steel colors in the bottom. Hopefully that's kind of coming across in my abstract language that I've adopted here. But yeah, it's all going back and doing a full circle to Dundee and these multiple stories that I visited many times. And when they came down, when they brought them down, it was just a fascinating thing to see, very sublime. Watching it live in person, and just the meaning of it, that these houses were full of community, years and years of it, and now they're all dispersed again. It's just sort of emblematic of a lot of things that happen. So here's a little video of the creation of one of these Treeline pieces. Can you see I'm really like working with color theory to try and get that sense of the artificial color schemes, but the realistic sort of natural color schemes intermixing, interplaying, to comment on this nature culture collide. And I'm ending on a little quote from John Baudrillard, really inspirational book called America. Really touches a lot to do with the theory of hyperreality, and I find this quote really, really effective for thinking about this Treeline series, especially that last part of the quote where he's talking about the sublime verticality and the decay on the ground. I think that quote really has a deep connection with what I do with this particular series. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dana, for that fascinating presentation. It's so interesting to see the work that we have in the gallery, in the exhibition here in the museum, in the context of your broad interests. And to me, it resonates in a sense, particularly with this idea of deconstructing the landscape and basically constructing it or building it yourself again with the use of shape and color. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, we have a couple of questions coming in on the comment box, but one of the things that I wanted to mention for those of you who are watching this and who haven't seen the exhibition yet, is that even though there's this idea of hyperreality, if you get really close to these paintings, you'll see Dana's, you'll see some of the application of paint, you'll see her hand, right, present in these paintings. And so it's really interesting to see them up close and then to step back and kind of take in this whole context that you were talking about. So we have a question from Anna, who says she relates to the culture shock aspect you shared with us. She asks, did the corporations who bought your paintings get the irony and embraced it, or not necessarily?
Yeah, this is one of the things I have to deal with as an artist who has a gallery who represents them and sells my work. And often my work is out in the realms without art statements attached to them. So people, I think they're alone. The work has to speak for itself, and whether or not they're going to see their irony is even more ironic, actually. I find that quite hilarious. And it placing it inside the culture in which I'm critiquing, yet it's probably just now being completely absorbed. Yeah, it's quite fascinating to think about.
Yeah, and it's interesting too in the different contexts, right? Outside and inside, and in the different circumstances where it's displayed and how it may be read in against those backdrops. Mm-hmm. Rachel brings up a point that I've been thinking about in terms of color. She says, I noticed you have a particular color palette for each Treeline painting. How do you balance the individuality of each piece with the unity of the entire series? What is it about series that you enjoy?
Oh, I love questions where I can talk about the process a little bit more. But yeah, like actually painting, the process of painting is so enjoyable for me. It like feels like a guilty pleasure. I just like in awe of color and I can't stop using it. But with the actual choices with color, I was really trying to get the sense of time passing. So you'll sort of notice the warm to cool shift, which is echoing the time of day, like in the day of the light changing. Looking at all the inspiration from like Monet's paintings of the haystacks, for example, in all different times of the day. But keeping like something that's threaded all the way through is the greens, the life, the is signifying obviously the real nature out there that I particularly find interesting at this time during COVID time, that I've been inside forests. I've made myself like go to forest as a therapy for being okay with the whole COVID times this last year. So a lot of time has been spent camping in forests. So that green is like infiltrating my brain and healing my brain. But that's the common thread that's through all the paintings to connect them formally. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, and the colors are so vibrant and so rich, right? And some of them make me think of this commercial aspect when you were talking about the strip malls or the commercial sections of 1792, and it makes me think of some of the colors that have this very bright or artificial quality juxtaposed with the more, like you were saying, the greens and the colors that are more related to nature, and that juxtaposition is really vibrant and interesting. Another question from Rachel Walton. She says, interesting how homesickness is part of your inspiration. Is this something that you share with your students in your art teaching, as students might be feeling the same way when living away from home for the first time?
Yeah, definitely. I practiced this presentation yesterday on my students, and it was great because I was able to like go, the breads. And they were all in, a lot of them were international students, and going, yeah, the bread. So we have a lot of like laughs about it, and that's the thing. I hope my work, even though it's dealing and critiquing the situation of this horrible clash between nature and culture. At the same time, there's a lot of joy and humor, I hope, that comes across in the work. So that offer of hope, I hope, comes through as well. But yeah, with the students, a lot of it is just laughing at the situation.
And it's just an invitation to look, right, at some of these structures that maybe we drive by every day and we're not looking as closely, and finding these instances of whether it's delight in the color or the irony, as Anna was saying, in terms of what you're saying with your work. Dawn has a comment and a question here. She says, you have such love of color and handle it with such nuance, but I know you have made a few works in recent years that were deliberately in black and white. Did you have to approach these works differently in terms of your process or thinking?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, the shift from color to black and white for me is just a formal one. It's not necessary. I love color. I love playing with it, but sometimes what I need to say is more strong if I use the contrast of simple like black and white and gray. So the economy of that is sometimes key to the conversation of what I'm dealing with. So it depends on the subject matter. When I was doing a different sort of version of these blocks, I did a version that was on white and black on cardboard, and it was really dealing with some more heavier matters of homelessness and the wall of that President Trump wanted to build, and I didn't want the color in there. The artificiality of the color did not come into the conversation. It needed to be more of a black and white matter. So it's conceptually a choice, but obviously formally I usually gravitate towards color because it's so fun.
And I love how through these compositions you're responding to these very timely issues that matter, whether in Scotland, as you were sharing with us, and or here in Florida. I wonder, before we turn it over to Audrey, what would you like visitors to take away from experiencing your work in the exhibition?
I'm happy with their interpretation. The prompts will maybe come through with the titles, and then but the experience of that sort of artificiality, of the hyper-real, of the representation of something in our world that exists, that whether it's man-made or natural, that they would kind of be almost visually assaulted, just like we're bombarded visually with advertising. But not that I want to, make people offended, but just that we're so used to that in our daily lives, just to be assaulted visually, and that we've become quite accustomed to it. But if they're looking at my work, I just hope that it'll trigger some of these thoughts on nature and culture, and the future way that we can live in our natural world, and some of the issues we're always dealing with, such as public land being redeveloped, and the fight to save some of our state parks. And there's always issues coming up that I care about, that I hope that somehow it comes through in some of my work. So
wonderful. Thank you so much, Donna. We're going to turn it over to Audrey Hope. And again, we're going to have time at the end of her presentation for questions and comments. So keep your comments and questions coming in the comment box.
Thank you so much. That was really great presentation, Donna, and I'm excited to follow it because a lot of my work has very much related concerns that make for great conversations across the department. But today I'm going to talk about two different ways of working that are on view in the museum right now. So I created 3 new works for the show that's at CFAM right now. And they're represented by these 2 different modes that I use in my practice that are super interrelated. So one is this fabric piece that is comprised entirely out of rubbings taken from the Walk of Fame here at Rollins College. And that also incorporates embroidery of all these little objects onto it. So I'll show you that first. And then second, I'll talk about this collage on photograph process that's represented by the 2 works there on the right. So I'm gonna move us ahead. Okay, is that happening? Okay, great. So the Walk of Fame, for those of you who don't know, here at Rollins College is this very fascinating collection of stones that was initiated by Hamilton Holt, a former president at Rollins College in 1929. And I could talk for a very long time about this collection, but like Donna, I'm very interested in stones as a kind of object within my art practice and as a subject. And so this project sort of started when I got to Rollins this fall and was thinking about what it means for this collection of stones to be on campus. And so the thing that, like, what Holt was actually envisioning with the Walk of Fame, these quotes here from a document called A Brief History of the Walk of Fame, compiled by some of the folks in the library who've been very helpful with this project. But he says that his goal for the walk was to have every man or woman, living or dead, whose services deserve the eternal remembrances of mankind. So all of those people were to be represented in the walk. And he started with a smaller collection of stones, and it ballooned over time. At one point, I believe there were about 800 stones in the collection. And there were periods of time during which, like especially apparently in the 50s and 60s, when people would just steal stones at graduation time or throw them in the lake. And it was this very chaotic collection. And that's what's super interesting to me, is that it's idiosyncratic and that it's strange and, you know, personal and biased. And yet there's also this intention that it would be like representing all the immortals on campus, then they would be represented on campus. And one of the rules, when he was trying to create the rules of the game to sort of limit this a little bit, was that only stones of nationally or internationally known men and women would be allowed in the walk. But of course, it's again, it's this like this very clear set of guidelines, and yet within it, there's so much like personal and desiring of just like longing for stones. And what do we even learn from these stones? Like, what are they doing? And they're very confusing to people who walk onto campus, of course, because they kind of look like headstones maybe, or are these meant to, are these like monuments to each of these people? It's a very kind of perplexing project that I think is really interesting in terms of like an artist's logic. It's a very creative way of approaching the stones. And so here I have a visual representation of kind of my relationship to the Walk of Fame, I would say, embodied in one of my favorite people on campus, Imogen, who is hugging a stone and telling me about how it is her favorite stone on the Walk of Fame. And it seems to me that the reason that it is because it sort of fits her body nicely in this little yoga pose pillow. And so that's how I think about stones a lot of times, is like, how do they relate to human bodies? Because so many of these stones were collected from places associated with the people they were meant to represent. But that could be pretty, like a pretty great distance from those actual people. And so we can talk a little bit more about what that actually means, what how they got here, the different stories of the stones later on, maybe in the questions. But one of the other really interesting things in this big collection of stones full of you know, bias and prejudice and all the things that make up us are a group of 9 stones that were removed from the collection this summer because in the moment of all of the racial justice protests. It was a way of acknowledging that because each of these stones commemorated an advocate for slavery or a Confederate Army general. So if you go back to the idea of internationally or nationally recognized, those stones really didn't even meet that standard. And then in one of my conversations with one of the librarians here on campus, she said very, very diplomatically that Confederate generals were overrepresented in the collection. And I thought that was a very polite way of putting it. But the process of taking rubbings from all these stones, so I took rubbings from about 3/4 of the stones on the walk, mostly over winter break so that I could have a little bit of peace and privacy. But of course, there were all kinds of just people walking through and kind of curious about what this was. And so we had some fun conversations about what this is. And so I ended up making rubbings of about 3/4 of the stones on the Walk of Fame. And those are what are represented in this piece here. So this is the piece that's on view, and it's double-sided, so you can walk around it. And it is embroidered with all these different kind of personal stones. So that same taste of taking souvenirs or taking little shreds of things and bringing them back and incorporating them into this hodgepodge of material that adds up to a kind of swirl. And so again, like Donna, I'm thinking about this kind of bombardment with plastic objects and bright colors and a mix of things that are natural and man-made that come together, and also a mix of things that are incredibly personally significant and then also maybe found in the trash. So for example, on the right in this image, you can see that there's a little piece of leftover lace from when my mom made her wedding dress in 1980. But then there's also doilies that someone's mom's grandma said, oh yeah, you definitely need these because you have such a taste for little tiny detailed things. And so the differences in value are really interesting to me, being able to like push all of these things up against each other and to create this conversation of materials. So we have all the rubbings that I did from the Walk of Fame, along with all of these embroidered materials built into it. And that's what this piece kind of adds up to. And so with each of these, the rubbings themselves take a little bit for them to become legible. The stones are all so old, and many of them are very weathered, so they're very hard to take these rubbings from. And then, of course, I've arranged them in this kind of Baroque, like swirling, inner folding set of curtain-like movements that make it take a little while for some of them to become revealed, to become visible. And so that is sort of my artistic take on this this space of the Walk of Fame here. And I'm going to show you a few images of behind the scenes. So you'll notice that where Donna took a look at the grand themes of her practice, I'm focusing in here on a little snippet of just what I've been thinking about for the past few months. But of course, that all relates back to the many years of art practice that I've been participating in. And here on the right, you see like flowers that are pulled from the trash at the cemetery in Petaluma, the Liberty Cemetery, near my parents' house that I collected during the pandemic while I was staying with them. And so all of these materials, they're sort of this mix of plastic and trash. And then right next to those is a pom-pom from a very glamorous sort of shoulder piece that a friend of mine bought me in Paris, and that eventually I included a piece of it in here. So all of these different elements from different sources kind of add up to the material that is both this mix. And so here you see on the right some fabric that was dyed using a natural process and a natural dyeing process, and some rope that was made by students in my Sculpture 1 class that was also incorporated in the piece. And then on the left, you see the more synthetic dye process that I use to get these much brighter, more vivid colors for the piece. And I'm really interested in mixing those together, mixing those natural and very unnatural processes together. And so here you can see some of the layering of the different rubbings. And that rubbing process is very photographic to me. It's like a printmaking process, because you have the stone and then you lay that piece of fabric over the top of it, and then you're placing pigment onto the fabric in order to get the kind of negative image of what's underneath of it. So it has this indexical relationship to the original stone. So each print is made from the stone that it's representing. And I see that as very closely related, at least semiologically, to photography. And these photographs, then I'll show you in a little bit some of the other ways that I think about integrating photographs and sculptures. So this is one of the many, many little materials that is sewn into the piece. And I just wanted to draw special attention to it because it's some type of a relic. It's technically the cross itself is a reliquary, which means housing for a relic. And then the relic inside, I have no clue where it comes from. It looks like a fragment of bone, maybe a saint, I don't know. But thinking about those fragments and pulling pieces from places and using those pieces to represent the thing that they are coming from in another place. That's what's really interesting to me about the Walk of Fame. And that's how I see it as tying back to these other traditions of collecting and stealing and fragmenting in order to kind of add up to some kind of story that we can tell ourselves. And so similarly, in these wall-mounted works, I'm doing kind of the same thing, where I'm thinking about this the way that we can use the materials of a landscape, the way they can kind of come together to create this really satisfying surface. So this is an image maybe from Black Bear, from a hike I took this winter since coming here. And then here you can see up close the very unnatural, so we had our natural landscape, and now I have this very unnatural swirl of materials. And here, this idea of gift giving becomes even more important, because in the the Walk of Fame. And then in my piece about the Walk of Fame, which is titled Cemetery, Museum, Souvenir, all of the objects that are incorporated there are some sort of gift. And similarly, most of these objects are also some sort of gift, the pieces that come together to create this collage. So this is a collage on a large photograph with all of these different kind of dusty materials that you can kind of have an experience of visualizing them as this textured surface from a distance, or this really highly detailed surface from up close. And this black hair kind of looking thing that I'm zeroing in on here for you is a horsetail that was gifted to me by my friend Susan in 2014. So a lot of these materials, they stick around. There are little seashells that are like fake and part of a craft collection that my friend Cara gave me, or fingernails from my friend Tanya, and everything kind of adding up to this very, to me, satisfying surface. It's a form of sketching is how I think of this process, adding all of these materials up to create this other kind of like appealing and also disgusting surface. So here you can see a bit of the piece that is visible on the right in the museum, and it incorporates a snakeskin that my dad found in the woodpile and my stepmom shipped to me. So the snakeskin resembles some of the photographs that are underneath of it. So here you can see the piece in progress. And this is an older photograph of mine of an interior garden. There's no reason that you need to know this necessarily, but here you are in my little, I'll bring you into the circle of references of mine. So here it is a photograph of the garden of an artist named Miguel Ventura in Mexico City in a neighborhood called Tlalpan. And you can see this photograph I used in another sculpture when I was thinking about it more as an image or a set of two images that I was bringing together in conversation. And then separate from that, I was thinking about these types of built-up surfaces out of natural found man-made materials that come in to create this kind of accretion. And but this is a show from 2017 where these were on view separately, and since then I've brought them into conversation as these surfaces get denser and become this kind of Garden of Eden, Florida swamp landscape. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Audrey, for all the insights into your process and your work. And I'm really fascinated by this idea of how you are taking things that you see, whether in nature or in the Walk of Fame, in your context, in your surroundings, and incorporating that into your art, but also letting go of things that must be very personal, right? These things that each of them carry a story, and how you put them in your work and give them over to the viewer to reinscribe them with our own meaning and our own set of ideas and notions.
Thank you. Yeah, they it might seem like generosity, but they would bury me alive if I kept them.
Well, I mean, it's an opportunity to see them from a very different perspective. And along those lines, there's a question here from Anna. She says, you make some timely and necessary comments on the Walk of Fame. Where do you go, or where do we go from here in terms of articulating its place and role, if any, in the 21st century?
It's a great question, because it's not pedagogically useful. It's confusing to people. It's not a monument, in my opinion. I don't read it that way. I don't know whether, it's kind of like, should we just hide it under a rock? It's a bizarre form of collecting. And I know in talking to students, they say that it's never present or rarely mentioned in the tours. And I can understand why, because it's a complex thing. It's like, let me explain to you like the practices of collecting in the early 20th century and how they worked and what that means for us now. And it's, I love the Walk of Fame, even as strange and useless as it is. I think it's wonderful aesthetically and in terms of being a relic of that time. And those ways of collecting that are still really important to us. So it's not like something you get rid of because you are a little embarrassed of the history. It is how we talk about history. This is what formed it. So I think it's really important to pay attention to. It's just also important that in our classrooms, we're continuing to remind students that just because we're studying something doesn't mean it's right or true or good. That's not why we examine things.
Right, and I think, you know, these piece in particular and this process that you've documented in your piece is part of perhaps an opportunity to rethink and to look at the role, as Anna was saying, the role of this thing on our campus and what does it mean, which we can translate to monuments across our country and elsewhere, right? And how they are chosen and made and in what context. Mm-hmm. Robert here says, I love your circle of references. I do too, the idea of the circle of references when you talked about and shared some of the insights of the photographs you used. Rachel asks, how does your cemetery monument souvenir piece contribute to or relate to the ongoing removal of public monuments across the US in the last few years? Do you see this work as having activist intentions?
I see it as having like conceptualizing intentions. I don't see it as advocating for the removal of this particular collection of stones, for example, because I think it's kind of like I answered in the last question, it's very important. And the other thing is that there are some remarkable stones in the Walk of Fame for some really remarkable civil rights leaders like Mary McLeod Bethune. And so she founded Bethune, what became a university in Daytona and it started as a boarding school for Black girls. She was the child of enslaved parents, and she became one of the most important civil rights leaders in the 20th century. And then she also is specifically, you know, a Florida-specific figure. So I think it was really remarkable that to find, like, as I was going through, I was like, oh, wow, okay, so she got an honorary doctorate here in 1949 when she was still an advisor to FDR. And so that kind of moment from the Walk of Fame made me really proud of some of the people who are memorialized in the stone in an intentional way. So someone, when I don't know the history of that particular stone, went out and sought her out and said, here, we're going to give you this honorary doctorate. We're going to give you this stone on the Walk of Fame. And that to me is very like touching and moving, and does make, like, that moment to me is a personal monument.
I love that idea of the personal monument, especially considering the three pieces that are in the museum and how much of your own journey, right, and your own connections and your own friendships are embedded in those works against that context of history and social issues and what they mean for us today. Dawn asks, how does the scale and presentation of the fabric work correspond with your ideas around problematizing the Walk of Fame?
Well, it makes it very loud, certainly. And, you know, that's a tendency in my work too, is to just kind of like make something really big that you can't ignore, that is attractive and kind of disturbing at the same time. Like when you were asking Donna what question or what sensations she wanted people who came into the museum to have, or I took it as, I want a sensation for my audience. I want them to like want to lick or like chew on this like really disgusting thing, and to be enveloped and consumed by it in a way where it's like inescapable and in the round, like you can walk all the way around it. So that's how I would say the scale and presentation, as Dawn pointed out, relate.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I thought about that I was intrigued by when I visited you in the studio last fall, you were working on those wall pieces, and you shared with me some of the stories of some of the objects that you were handling and thinking about for the fabric piece. And it gave me a sense of, this is very personal, but I want to know more, right? You mentioned like bits and pieces of stories, like a friend gave me this watch one time we went out, and then your friend in Mexico, and I just was so drawn to it that I wanted to know more about the stories as I'm looking at the material, right? It's almost an archaeology of something that is very, very much alive and timely and still evolving, which I find definitely fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. Each one is like a portal. That's
Right.
very much how I see objects and the stones, for example.
Excellent. Let's see if there are any other questions. Hey, Donna. Do you have any questions for Audrey? Or Audrey, do you have any questions for Donna before we wrap up?
I love the intersection of all the artists' work, but since it's you and I, especially what you talked about, the artificiality and the man-made elements and the natural elements and how they come together within your work. Pieces of plastic, the synthesized, and then the authentic, I suppose, and the relics, that deep history with the pieces you find. It's really fascinating how there's cross-fertilization going on there.
I agree, Donna. Yeah, it was really fun to get to think about the landscape, especially in terms of both of our works and the way that that impacts both of the stories that we're trying to tell.
Absolutely. There's maybe one final question from Robert, who asks, or two final questions. Robert asks, how do you think moving to Florida has affected your work?
Well, I would say, I think it's a new set of questions and it's that new landscape. So like what Donna was saying about thinking back to her personal landscapes and a series of them, it's very much true for me. When I was creating prior works, I was thinking about how to represent a San Diego landscape or a Santa Cruz landscape, like in a very, very specific way. Obviously, like my fabric piece doesn't represent an all Florida landscape. It represents a very particular time and place on the campus of Rollins College. And I think about also just the flatness of Florida and how it's so remarkable that here there are no rocks. Except for the ones that Donna showed us at Disney. There aren't any rocks. Like, where are they going to get the rocks from? It's a swamp. And so to see, it makes those New England rocks that were dragged down here for the Walk of Fame all that much more remarkable, because we don't have rocks. And so that's like, I think, an interesting question as well about the landscape.
Thank you. And I think maybe the one final question, Anna asks, and I think we all want to know, assuming that you have talked about the work with your students, what do they think about the Walk of Fame?
They don't. They don't think about it. They notice it on occasion. What do they even think about it? I don't know. I'll ask them tomorrow. We've talked in class about the removal of the 9 stones that specifically commemorated advocates for slavery and Confederate generals. But of course, there are many stones of slaveholders still in the Walk of Fame. And we've talked about what that gesture was, what it meant to make that move, and what it meant for the campus, or what kind of a gesture it was, or what scale it was, because I think some of the students have talked about, we need a bigger move, and that the Walk of Fame is not necessarily like the only place for racism on campus. But I think that's kind of as far as the conversation has gone. Like, I don't think they're just kind of perplexed and intrigued very mildly by it.
And the stones that were removed are now part of the collection of the library archives. Is that right? So that people...
Yeah, I believe so. And of course, also just noting, like, there were 800 stones in the walk, and it's not that it's a very much like pared down, curated collection at this point.
Right, but those that were recently removed can still be studied and researched. And it's not that they have been
they weren't like shaded.
They're part of the archival repository of the college.
There's still something to be learned from. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I want to thank Donna and Audrey for joining us tonight and for these wonderful insights into your practice and your artwork and the pieces that are here in the museum on view. For those of you who join us tonight, thank you for being here with us. The exhibition is open until August 29th, so it will be up throughout the summer. You can also experience it virtually and take a virtual 360 tour on our website, rollins.edu/CFAM, and join us next Tuesday for a conversation with professor and artist Don Rowe and professors and artists Rachel Simmons and Lee Lines. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.